Hello, everybody. Welcome to my presentation today. I'm going to be talking about the history of writing in Korea, and specifically focusing on Hangul, which is the script that we use today. So before Hangul was used, there was no native writing system for Korean. So even though they had their own unique language, the Koreans actually used Chinese characters because that was a very influential language at the time. It was a lingua franca. It was used throughout that area of Southeast Asia to conduct trade and diplomacy, etc. But Chinese characters are very, very difficult to learn. Literacy in Chinese takes a very long time, lots of study. Um, so that meant that the literacy was limited to the elite and the nobility and the government officials. So your average Korean citizen would not have had a way to write things down. But even among the nobility, there was variation in skill because it was so complicated. So several systems were developed that had varying levels of mixing between Korean and Chinese in order to meet those varying needs. So you have Idu. This was a modified system. As you can see in the block, it says the word order was changed and there was some grammatical elements added like particles, suffixes. This system was used mostly by lower government officials who didn't have enough training to use the full Chinese writing system. Then you have Gyugyo. This system was used mostly for transcribing religious texts. And once again, it was modified with grammatical elements from Korean. And one of the final major systems was Yongchal, which was used for songwriting because obviously it's very hard to write a song in one language and then transcribe it into a completely different writing system that doesn't even correlate to what you're saying. So they would use the Chinese characters for meaning, and then they would use the phonetic characters that Chinese also has in order to show the sounds that you should be saying at that time. So they kind of made a bridge between the two languages for that purpose. So in 1443, though, King Sejong of the Joseon dynasty decided that he wanted to kind of uplift the lower class and develop a system so that they too could enjoy literacy. And so he developed what is now known as Hangul. At the time, it was called Hunminjangum, but Hangul was a term that was actually not used until later, and Hangul now means great script. But the process of creating the system is kind of unknown. Obviously, it was like 600 years ago, so not a very not necessarily well documented. As you'll see later, there was actually resistance and pushback against the system, so some of the records and documents have been lost. So some records, the traditional account is that he created it by himself. He's known for being a scholar, and so that is the traditional account of what happened. Some people think that it was the credit in the records was given to him as a kind of deferential gesture, but that in reality he was helped by his like inner court. And other people think that he was helped by the crown prince and other people who were very closely related to him. So they would also have access to the resources to learn and develop something like this. One of the main pieces of evidence for him developing it by himself is that he knew there was going to be resistance to the system. And so in order to keep it secret and so that he could not be hindered in the process of developing it, he kept it secret until it was fully developed and didn't tell anybody in the inner court. A document, even though the system itself was released in 1443, another document called Hunminjeongeum Hare or Herie was published in 1446, and this basically means Hunminjeongeum explanation and examples. So there's a picture of it right there at the bottom. As you can see, there's some familiar characters. If you look at the far left column, about halfway down, you can see Tiget, but above it and below it are these kind of other little circles that you wouldn't really see in modern Korean. And so that's partially just a style of writing that's not there, but especially the hollow circle is actually a vowel that's not used in modern Korean. And as you can see, there's even in the system, there's still used a lot of Chinese characters, so they were still kind of transitioning. So the development and the reasoning behind it had several principles. First, it needed to be simple. It needed to be able to be understood by someone who had very little education and wouldn't require a lot of training or effort to understand and would be easy to use. The second, especially in regards to consonants, is that it's kind of based off of the mouth shape. So for my linguistics majors, you can see a list of the different kinds of or areas of the mouth in the bottom right. We have velars, which is the kind of the back, almost at the beginning of the throat, but at kind of the base of the tongue. There's alveolars, which are right above your teeth on the kind of the gum line. Bilabials is when both your lips are being used. Dentals use your teeth, and glottals use the glottis in your throat. So as you can see, for example, kiak kind of indicates that there's a raising of the tongue in the back. As you can see, it's all the way up in the back. But in kind of an opposite, Nien shows that there's not much raised in the back, but the tongue is raised in the front. And another way is the mium is like a box, which kind of represents the shape of a closed mouth, which is the shape you make whenever you're making an M sound. So that's some scholars have debated whether or not that actually was the basis for the shapes, but you can see how kind of there's like these baseline symbols of Giog, Neon, Neum, and Ian, and then you progress onward towards more complex things that are made in the similar part of the mouth. Then you have Kiok, which is the aspirated version, Tigit, which is alveolar stop, and then Tigit, which is the aspirated version of that. So you can see how it kind of starts with a base symbol that references the mouth shape, progresses to something more complex as it goes along. The vowels reference the Buddhist principles of yin and yang. The horizontal lines represent earth, the vertical lines represent humanity, and the short strokes represent heaven. So this is all about the principles of balance and the kind of interplay between humanity and heaven and earth that is part of that religion. And that also flows into vowel harmony. So we know that certain vowels can go together and certain vowels cannot. And this is kind of part of that reasoning is the reason that he made, for example, O and A be able to go together, but not U and A is kind of a reference to the ways that heaven and earth and humanity interact. So referencing kind of the simplicity again, a famous saying about Hangul is that a wise man can acquaint himself with the characters in a morning, and even a stupid man can learn them in the span of 10 days. So that was kind of the driving force. This one needed to be a simple, understandable system that anybody could use. So like I said earlier, there was resistance. Sejong knew that there would be resistance, and there was. Immediately, the nobility resisted the use of the new system because they wanted to retain the status that being the only educated group gave them. But he ignored them and continued to use the system. After Sejong's death and the death of his um, crown prince, later, about 60 years later, King Yong Sangun banned the use of the system because there was a document written that was critical of him. They didn't think he was a very good king. And so he ordered all the books about it to be burned. You couldn't learn it. You couldn't use it. Totally taboo. It's actually thought nowadays that a noble actually wrote the document, not someone of the lower class, but they used the Hangul system to kind of retain anonymity, because if they had written in Hanja or in the Chinese script, it would have been very obvious that only a few number of people could be able to do that. But even so, even after the books were burned and the practice was banned, it experienced a resurgence later in that century as alphabet books and other types of poetry were became popular among the artists and authors of the times. And so they started using Hangul more and more. So the resistance wasn't able to overwhelm the system for very long. So in more modern times, the script itself started gaining more attention and more recognition from the top down, from the government. And so in the 1890s, with an increased kind of feeling of nationalism among the Korean nation, they decided to adopt Hangul as their official script. And within only a few years of that, elementary schools started teaching it, and the first newspaper, Toknip Shinmun, was written in the script. I don't actually have a picture of it here, but Toknip Shinmun actually was written right to left, top to bottom, so which is how Chinese is written. So you can see that even though they were kind of moving away from the Chinese influence, it still was very important to that system and to their history. And it wasn't until even later, more closer to the present day, that Korean started being written in a more Western style, left to right, with spaces and Western punctuation. During the Japanese occupation of Korea, there were several reforms that occurred. The first one was somewhat limited. A vowel called rea, which is that dot that I talked about earlier, was restricted to Sino-Korean words. So words that had kind of melded from the Chinese language into Korean language. And the tense vowels, which have the more familiar forms in the next line, the like san, tiga, san, kiak, all those, adopted a form where they use shiat and the letter to represent them. And that was in 1912. But in 1930, the vowel area was abolished entirely, and tense consonants were changed to the form that we see today, where it's the double consonant. So as you've seen, Hangul has undergone a lot of modernization and a lot of attention from both the government and from outside. The final kind of spelling, the final major spelling reform was done actually just 1 year after the Japanese occupation ended in 1945, and that kind of standardized the spelling fully and gives us the form that we see today, more or less. And personally, I think that Hangul as a script has a really, really bright future for the Korean language and even other languages, perhaps, because as you can see, it's It's been developed specifically for this language, and it's also very simple. Whereas you have something like English that's changed a lot over time, still is pretty static today, but it's not necessarily the best system. So maybe in the future, a script will come in that changes how we write English into something more simple, like you see with Hangul. Like I said, Hangul is actually even used in languages other than Korean today. The Hunminjeom Society in Korea advocates for the use of the script in languages that don't have a script yet. So one example is a small town in Indonesia actually adopted it unofficially, and you can see here the Hangul script along with the traditional with Latin letters for the words. So you can see that even though it's a very Korean script, it's actually being used elsewhere, and we might see more of that in the future. Thank you for your time and your presentation. I hope you all have a great end of your semester, and 열심히 공부해요.